The sun does one of three things to planets it gets close to. It hides it, burns it, or crowns it. Hey everybody, welcome back. I am Dana Solara. I'm an astrologer and spiritual coach. We're talking today about Cazimi, combustion, and under the beams, and specifically what they mean for planets in your birth chart. One of my favorite things to teach are what I like to call astrology cheat codes. These next level techniques that are not as widely discussed, but can really give you a deeper sense of what a planet in your birth chart is like. Your birth chart has such a deep treasure trove of information about who you are on a spiritual level, what kind of lessons you're here to learn, what your purpose is. And if we are only reading our chart as planet, sign, and house, we're going to miss so much nuance. One of the things we can look at is a planet's proximity to the sun, and that's what Under the Beams, Combustion, and Cazimi all tell us about. But first, I'll share a little bit of background about these different classifications of planets close to the sun. These significations come from traditional astrology, and the underlying logic behind them was visibility. In ancient times, people were literally looking at the sky to see the planets. And when a planet got too close to the sun, it would start to become less visible at first, then it would become completely invisible, and then we would start to see it again on the other side. So a planet too close to the sun will disappear. Traditionally, astrologers read that invisibility as a planet being unable to act on its own behalf. It's there, it's working, but no one can see it. But there's an exception to this, and that's when a planet is at the very center, when it's in the same place in the sky as the sun. So if you get close enough to the sun, you're not in the glare anymore. You're at the center. You're in the light source. And so this is how we get these three different distinctions of under the beams, combust, and Cazimi. If you don't already have your chart handy, pause this video, go pull up your chart. I'll have a tutorial down below for you if you need help figuring out how to get your birth chart for free. Now, when it comes to using this information to help you understand your birth chart placements more deeply, you want to go beyond the natural significations of the planet and look at what that planet is in charge of in your birth chart. For example, if you have Mercury combust, that is going to make Mercury invisible in the sky the moment you were born. We'll talk about what that means symbolically, but you wouldn't just think about mercurial things. You would also think about the places in your chart that Mercury is in charge of. For example, if you're a Pisces rising, you have Virgo in your 7th house and Gemini in your 4th. So that means if Mercury is combust in your chart, that the symbolism of Mercury being combust does play into your 4th and your 7th house topics, your home and your family, as well as your partnerships. So let's talk a little bit more about what these significations actually mean, and we'll look at some examples as well. We'll talk about the Cazimi to start. I want you to picture with the Cazimi the king's throne room. Every other planet in the glare of the sun is stuck outside getting scorched, but the one that got called in and seated next to the sun is the planet that's Cazimi. It's fascinating because the planet is still experiencing the warmth and the fire and the heat of the sun, but in a way that's restorative and rejuvenates rather than burns up. What a Cazimi does symbolically is gives that planet this solar infusion, this purified, distilled, full strength energy. And in your birth chart, we could say it's fusing that with your core sense of self, because we know the sun in the birth chart represents the sense of self, the spirit, the calling, what you're driven to do on a soul level, as well as father figures, authority figures, and leaders. And again, whatever house topics are activated by the planet that's Cazimi will be affected by the Cazimi as well. So we're taking a look at Elizabeth Taylor's chart. She was born with a Mercury Cazimi in Pisces, and I think this is a really interesting example because Mercury is in its detriment in fall in Pisces. Now, I have Mercury in Pisces as well, and I'm a big believer that planets with so-called poor dignity, planets in detriment or fall that are under-resourced in a birth chart actually carry a lot of gifts and blessings. They just may not always feel like it. And when we see a planet that's Cazimi in this condition, it gives a lot of highs and lows. And I happen to know people personally with these kinds of placements, and I've seen it over and over again. It gives extremes. Let me tell you what I mean. So, Mercury runs things like commerce, voice, negotiation. It's the art of the deal, it's the business person, it's your ability to articulate your ideas, it's analysis, it's curation, it's critiquing, it's questioning. It's very scientific and it's very inventive and it's also very funny. It's the jokester. So, what is Elizabeth Taylor remembered for? Well, I would say her films, but also her fragrance line. White diamonds, hello, iconic. I can smell it right now, actually. I don't know if anybody's wearing white diamonds today, probably not, but her fragrance line did over $1 billion in cumulative sales and was still doing tens of millions of dollars a year at the end of her life. That's Mercury Cazimi. That's mercantile intelligence sitting at the heart of the sun. Now, this chart is super interesting to me because we can see a lot of the more important things about her life story just by looking at Mercury Cazimi. We look at what Mercury is in charge of here, the 7th house, Gemini, as well as the 10th house, Virgo, and she has this Cazimi opposite Neptune. Now, Neptune is retrograde, so this is actually a separating opposition, but it is still pretty tight within a degree. She also has Mars co-present in the 4th, so that's flavoring things as well. Elizabeth Taylor was famously married 8 times, which by today's standards is a lot, but she was born in 1932. So in the prime of her life, this was basically unheard of to be married that many times. And we know Mercury in Pisces can struggle with ideals versus reality. Mercury's in a Jupiter-ruled sign here, and Jupiter is very hopeful and optimistic and wants to believe the best in people. Now, Mercury is naturally very critical and analytical, and that's not a negative thing inherently. In fact, it's quite a helpful capacity to have. So we could see, and I'm not an expert on Elizabeth Taylor's life, but that perhaps there is a wanting to see the best in people and sort of maybe a naivety about other people and not being able to recognize the facts sometimes about other people. And so there's a challenge to overcome there. And we see that play out in her life story just by the sheer number of times that she was married. It also really speaks to the highs and the lows that we see with a Mercury that's debilitated in detriment and fall, but also Cazimi. A lot of love in her life, just a lot of dead ends, I guess you could say as well. Another interesting thing about Elizabeth Taylor's life is that she was a co-founder of the American Foundation for AIDS Research in 1985, and she started her own foundation in 1991. Very interesting because we see Neptune here in the 10th. We know Mercury rules the 10th house. There's something almost subversive about her doing this. And I'm talking about the fact that she is very publicly advocating for AIDS research in 1985 when this is very taboo. This is very feared. This is not something people want to be involved with. There's something very spiritual about her career. There's something about the collective that she's willing to be a voice for people. She used her power and her voice to advocate for other people. Now, you may not think about Neptune as an advocate, but I definitely think of Mars as an advocate. Mars is co-present here. And Neptune in her 10th is speaking to me of an importance of serving the collective, of bringing unity through her work. When I think about Neptune, I think about uniting people and being this unifying presence and energy and really using her voice and being unafraid, there's Mars again, to stand up and speak up for people who really needed it and to offer her resources to support others. Mercury's also in Pisces, just on a more surface level, very imaginative, very poetic, very expressive, and she's famously incredibly beautiful. And she really, I think, knew how to channel the energy of the character she was playing, and that's why she was so successful. So the way that she's known in the world is as this enchanting, intoxicating, beautiful woman, and the way in which she channels the energy of the character she's playing, it feels very Mercury and Pisces to me. The last thing I'll say about Elizabeth Taylor is she moved to the United States as a young girl, and she was discovered as a child. So I think it's interesting that relocation of home, leaving where she was born and coming to a new country was really the start of her career. And she started truly as a child, which fascinatingly, the ruler of Pisces is Jupiter here in the ninth house of long distance travel. So we could go on and on, but that's one really good example of how a Cazimi can show up. So now let's talk about combust planets. A planet is combust when it is too close to the sun. It's burned up. It's still there and it's still working, but you can't see it and neither can anyone else. So traditionally, we look at this as a weakness, as the planet being hidden, overpowered by something larger, the power of the sun, the heat of the sun. William Lilly's phrasing is that a person is in great fear and overpowered by some great person, which is quite blunt, but I think if you have a combust planet, you will be like, yeah, I get that. I have Venus, my ascendant ruler, as a Libra rising, combust the sun. My sun is at 23 degrees Pisces. Venus is at 17, which means Venus is 6 degrees from the sun. So we do have a mitigating condition here. A mitigating condition is where it's not as bad as it could be, basically. And in this case, in my case, Venus is not as burned up as she could be because she's said to be in her own chariot. Why? Because she's in Pisces, the sign of her exaltation. So Venus in Pisces is exalted. She's, again, lifted up. Think of it literally as being in a chariot. She's lifted up. She's kind of out of the muck of the worst it could possibly be. But it is still the case that she is combust. She's still here. And in my lived experience, I have experienced a little bit of both. Like I've definitely seen the chariot aspect play out in really getting out of trouble in a lot of instances because of who I knew. I'll give you a kind of a silly example. When I was under 21, I was at a concert. We were drinking in the parking lot, as you do when you're under 21 at a concert. And suddenly, out of nowhere, police cars pulled up. There were two of them, and they told us to get out of the car, and we were all about to get MIPs, which was a minor in possession. At the time, I worked as a teller at a bank in the same city as this concert venue, and it just so happened that one of the police officers in one of those two cars was a police officer who guards the bank on Saturdays. So I knew him, he knew me, and as soon as we made eye contact, he told the rest of the guys, we're not doing this. Abandon, abort. And we all got out of getting MIPs that night. And I have many stories like that that don't all involve drinking, of course, but I have definitely noticed that this run-in with authority figures that the combustion kind of promises, I have experienced it. There's more I could say about run-ins with people in leadership positions and people who I was supposed to obey and not agreeing with them and the challenges of that. But if you have a planet that's combust or under the beams, but has some other kind of dignity, you might see that it's not as bad as it could be, and that you've actually had a little bit of luck when it comes to the signification of combustion or under the beams. Symbolically, we could say when a planet is combust, the planet's affairs happen in private, or they take longer, or they get run by someone else's authority. So in the case of your ascendant ruler being combust, it's as if you yourself are under someone else's authority. If Venus were not my ascendant ruler, we might say who you love or what you value is not up to you. There's a level of autonomy, I think, that can get taken away with a planet combust or even under the beams. You could also read it in a more modern way, which is you've absorbed that planet into your identity so completely that you can't get far enough away from it to see what's not working. So something really obvious with Venus combust would be people pleasing, especially an exalted Venus, and guilty as charged. That's something my birth chart has really helped me work through and see in myself. But it's because it's so close to the sun, which can indicate the soul and the spirit, it's actually something that can become an impediment, and it feels really natural, but you don't see it that way because it's so second nature to you. It's like something about yourself that you can't quite see until someone else reflects it back to you. Now, there's some nuance with this, and it matters if the combust planet is applying, meaning moving toward the sun, or separating, moving away. I want you to check if the degree of the combust planet is behind in zodiacal order or ahead of in zodiacal order. If the planet is ahead and it's not retrograde, then you have a separating combustion. If it, like mine, is behind in zodiacal order and the planet in question is not retrograde, then we have an applying combustion. And if it's applying, the planet is moving toward the sun. It is sinking into the glare, and it is more challenging than a separating combustion, which we would read as moving away from, coming back into visibility. Bonatti, who's a famous medieval astrologer, compared it to somebody recovering from an illness. So it's the difference between getting sick and feeling better. We're going to look at Princess Diana's chart because she also has a combust planet in her chart. You see the sun in Cancer here at 9 degrees in her 8th house. And Mercury is retrograde at 3 degrees in Cancer as well. Mercury is retrograde, but it's within 6 degrees. So this is a separating combustion, given the fact that Mercury is moving away from the sun, but it is still very much combust here in the 8th house. So what do we know about Princess Diana? Obviously, she's royalty, and Mercury in her chart rules her 7th house as well as her 10th house. I do want to do a little sidebar to say the planets that we're going to see combust the most are Mercury and Venus, and that's because they never get too far away from the sun, so they're pretty consistently, or pretty often, I guess I should say, within 15, 8, or 1 degrees of the sun. Now, when we think about Mercury in the 8th house, I think there was an immense pressure on Princess Diana to keep the secrets of the family. All families have their shit, right? And the royal family is no exception. I'm not an expert on the royals or on Princess Diana, but from the research I've done, she really didn't have a lot of control over her life, right? Like being born into a royal family, a lot of your life is sort of decided for you. The 8th house being what we inherit. I mean, she literally inherits a royal title. So what she can say, how she conducts herself, it's all very laid out for her in tradition. So one thing about Princess Diana's life is her marriage to Prince Charles was full of problems. They both had affairs. And if you think about her being born into royalty, you can see the weight of the 8th house in that we're in the sign of Cancer. This is the sign of tradition in the family and lineage and heritage and how we do things around here. Tradition, very much a Cancer thing. She's got her moon in Aquarius, and you can see how she was rebellious. She was a rebel. And that feels a little contradictory to what we've been saying about Mercury combust, because you would think, based on just the basic interpretation of her voice disappears a little bit, her ideas and her mind, the way that she wants to think and speak is diminished by the authority. We can see that, but over the course of time, she does embrace her inner rebel. She has an interview at some point in her marriage where she kind of just gets very candid, and that was something that I don't think people really saw from royalty like that. There's this importance of how you comport yourself and hold yourself and what you do and don't say, and you don't talk about the family secrets and all of the shit we're trying to keep quiet. And there came a point in her life where she did. You can also see, though, this theme of other people being in charge of her life story, which you see literally when this guy, Andrew Morton, publishes a book, Diana, Her True Story. And in this book, not only were the affairs in her marriage exposed, but also the allegation that Diana was suicidal. So there's a way in which she's not in charge of her own story. Other people are telling her who to be, how to act, what to say, what not to say, deciding what's true and not true for her. And again, in this chart, Mercury's in charge of the 7th and the 10th. So it's not only speaking to her partnerships, but it's definitely speaking to the way she's seen in the world. Now you can see that Pluto and Mars are also here in the 10th house. So this theme of all of her secrets coming up over and over again really starts to show. The fact that the moon, which rules the 8th house, where this combustion between the sun and Mercury is happening, is in the 3rd house. It's in Aquarius, seems to say she will take back her voice. Like, she will reclaim her story. And in fact, during Diana's lifetime, both Diana and Andrew Morton, who wrote that book, denied Diana's direct involvement in the writing process and said that they were just friends. But after her death, Morton did acknowledge Diana's role in writing the tell-all in the book's updated editions. We'll never know from her mouth whether that's true or not, but it does make sense if you think about someone else was writing her story, but it was almost like she had someone ghostwrite it without putting her name on the book. And by having someone else, having a partnership in which someone else was the voice and the mouthpiece, she could really say what she wanted to say. Now, Princess Diana's death was very famous and arguably what she's known for, this violent death of dying in a car wreck. And there were a lot of conspiracy theories around it, one of which was that it had been planned by the powers that be back in Britain. And in fact, there were allegations that Charles was planning an accident, quote unquote, so that he could remarry because there were all these rules around the fact that they were royalty and how their marriage could be moving forward. And so this is a really fascinating example to me. There's so much more we could say, but I think this is a really compelling example of what a Mercury Cazimi can look like without any other dignity. Even though we can definitely see the struggle of the combustion, we can also see that there's something to be gained, that Diana ultimately has to find creative ways to claim her voice. And I think that she ultimately did do that in her life. So the last and final classification that we need to talk about is under the beams. The planet is dimmed. It's a little hard to make out, but it hasn't been burned completely. Now, this is the mildest of the 3 different classifications that we've talked about. The planet's affairs run quietly, privately, out of public view. It's working fine, but it's not as loud. It's not as on display. So we're going to take a look at our last example, which is going to be John Lennon. John Lennon had a Libra sun with Mars in Libra, technically under the beams. It's within 14 degrees and it is applying. So same thing goes for what we said with combustion. It is more challenging when a planet is applying or moving toward the sun versus when a planet is moving away. You're kind of getting out of it or recovering versus going into the illness when it's applying. So the thing about this setup is Mars is in detriment in Libra. This is a challenging place for Mars to be. It's a Venus-ruled sign, and Mars here can't be the way Mars wants to be as easily because Mars is very ego-driven. It wants what it wants. It wants to be single-minded. It wants to assert itself. It wants to go fight, win, and it wants to fight for what it believes in and protect what needs protecting. Well, here in Libra, this is a Venus-ruled sign that's about finding harmony and diplomacy with other people. So there's a passive aggressiveness that can come with Mars in Libra. There's a kind of hunger for righteous justice that can turn toxic if unattended to. And for John Lennon, this is a really big deal because Mars is his ascendant ruler. So this is a genuinely combative Mars. Aside from the fact that it's under the beams, it's Mars in the most conflict avoidant sign, and it's in the 7th house where it's very loud, and it's going to speak very loudly to partnership, which if you know anything about John Lennon's life, he was famously with Yoko Ono, and they famously had a very combative relationship. He also was abusive physically, I think mentally and emotionally probably as well. And so we see that pretty plain as day here. They had this separation that Lennon called the Lost Weekend, which was just 18 months of them being separated from 1973 to 1975. And he borrowed this phrase from a book. The phrase, the Lost Weekend, meant like a hazy memory of like drugs and drinking and partying, losing yourself on purpose. And what's really interesting to me is Yoko actually encouraged their assistant to be Lennon's lover during this separation, and they were the whole time. But Lennon also spent a lot of his time in Los Angeles just acting out, going wild, getting really drunk and partying. And this did lead to some pretty public brawls and fights and incidents, some Mars things. But I think it's fascinating that you see separation, which is definitely a Mars in the 7th house thing, in this way that looks pretty Venusian, in the sense that Yoko Ono, the wife, literally said, okay, here's another lover for you while we're separated. There's something very Mars and Libra for me about that. And also something kind of under the beams because there's a way in which it's sort of hidden, this combativeness. I think you could also read this as, especially because it's applying, that there's an element of asserting yourself too hard. we are talking about Mars after all. And I think this is an inferiority complex. For one, because Mars is Lennon's ascendant ruler. It is the planet that represents him embodied as an embodied human person the most in the chart. It's moving toward the sun. So it's as if there's this ideal. Now, the sun is also in fall in Libra. So it does speak to potentially daddy issues, which John Lennon's father did walk out on him as an infant. So that's there. And I think that's an important thing to remember too, because your chart is not just your psychology, it's also your context and your circumstances. And so anyone born under those circumstances with a father that walks out of them as an infant would have abandonment issues, would have attachment issues. I'm saying that very plain as day with this as well. But it's not always apparent. It's going to show up on the surface as this aggression that we see with Mars, not only being in detriment in Libra, but being the ascendant ruler, that there's this maybe bravado, there's this assertiveness, this dominance, this male machismo kind of thing. But underneath it is someone who's very afraid of being alone and will do whatever it takes to not feel that feeling of aloneness. We can see Mars also trines the moon up here. And it really just shows that what he wants most of all and his greatest wish for his life is to feel that deep connection to somebody. So like all things in the birth chart, what combustion or Cazimi or under the beams means for you really depends on your unique birth chart. So if you're curious about learning more about this, you can learn more about how to book a reading with me down below, but ask your questions in the comments. I'm happy to go back and forth with you guys and help you understand your birth charts as best as you can on your own. Subscribe if you haven't already. Ask your questions. I hope this was helpful, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.